Okay, everybody, I'm gonna try this again. Somehow my video got knocked out, maybe the location where I'm at. Okay, here we go. So we're gonna talk about during Jesus's time of when he lived on the planet and the kind of lifestyle and living that he lived during that time. So first of all, the type of house that he lived in Nazareth was a stone house. It was a very simple dwelling. And at that time, the structure itself was made of stone and of sod and of natural materials. The floor was a dirt-packed floor. There was no concrete or wood floors or special finishes. There was no plaster walls or drywall. There was no tchotchkes or adornments of decorations like we think a home should have. At that time, a simple structure of a house was a rectangular 400 square foot home. And that 400 square foot home housed 4 to 6 people, maybe 10 people, because you had mother, father, and children all living in the same space. And you think, wow, that's crowded, right? And to our standards of living, that was crowded, but that is how the people lived during that time. So you had one big room, all stone walls, and you had a doorway or entranceway, and then you had a window, not 10 windows, not a palladium window, a window. So one window, one door, okay? It really changes the scope of how easier it must have been that without electricity, without running water, without plumbing, just a structure with a roof over your head and 4 walls, and that simpleness and minimalism of that was you were able to just focus on the work at hand. Now, that means that an entire family, mother, father, and children, were all sleeping in one room. So how did they do this? They didn't have separate bedrooms. They didn't have separate rooms for separate functions like we luxuriously have. What they had was a simple grass or straw or bamboo mat that they rolled out. They then laid on that mat. They used their cloak or coat as their blanket covering. And their clothing and attire was 2 sets of clothing. Their everyday work clothing, their day-to-day clothing, 6 days a week shall you work, and 1 day a week shall you rest on the Sabbath. So 6 days they wore their work clothing. And generally that was like a linen toga, dress kind of thing with a belt. And that was it. And that was for men and women, okay? And then on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat, they would wear their nicest clothes, which was another, similar type of linen dress cloak type of a thing. And they would wear that on the Sabbath, and that's it. They had 2 sets of clothing in Nazareth. It was not, that was, quote, normalcy, okay? When the men woke up, they were part of what we would think today like a union type of a situation. Not in its total context, but just bear with me. Like the men, if they were masons, stone masons, they would get up and they would go to work, and whatever the Roman government was building at the time, whatever structures you had to show up. Like that was it. Like you didn't get to choose your job like today's unions. You didn't get to be like, I don't feel like going to work today. I'm not going to work today, and treat the union like a temp agency. No, you had to get up and go to work. And if you were a stonemason, you were working grueling, long hours in the hot sun. And your provision, your food for the day was bread and wheat and barley kernels or something. Maybe you had a piece of cheese, and you would eat off of the trees that were around by gleaning and glazing. So you would eat some figs, or you would eat fruit that was on a tree. You might have a handful of nuts in your pocket, or you might have a handful of figs or raisins, but that's it. Like, that was their sustenance. There was no Burger King. There was no, Chick-fil-A. There was none of that. Like, just simplicity again. And think of all the grueling, strenuous, laborious type of things that a stonemason would be required to do. And they did that on, let's again repeat, a vegetarian diet. Maybe if somebody caught fish, you might have some like sardine type fish, or fish roasted over a fire. But on the job, that might have been for dinner, but on the job they were eating bread and kernels and nuts and dried fruit. That was it. As for the women, their work day was carrying the water, which meant that there was no indoor plumbing. There was no, you turn on the faucet and the water is there. There was no showers. There was no bathing. Like, ladies, seriously, I think there's such an overemphasis on extra bathing and extra showering in today's world than what it was back then. So at that time, the women would have to carry the water. That meant carrying a large, heavy stone jar, usually balancing on their head, or maybe they had a cart that they would drag, to the water gathering place, or the well or cistern. That meant that they're walking to carry the empty jar, then they fill the jar, and then they have to carry the jar back. They might have to do that several times a day to have enough water based on the number of jars that their family owned, so that their family had enough water to do the daily tasks. And those daily tasks would be also washing clothing. Well, they didn't have these electronically advanced washer and dryers with an electronic panel that you say that you want to, gentle cycle your delicates. There was no such thing at the time. It was going to a stream or river, carrying all the heavy clothes of your entire family, not just you as a woman, but all the clothing of your family, and scrubbing them with a solution like baking soda and soap kind of a thing in a stream against a rock. Like, that's hard manual labor of scraping and beating the clothing on an actual rock. Okay, that was washing clothes. Then, in addition to that, the women were up very early in the morning, and they were taking the grain that they had either bought in the marketplace or got from their land, and then they were grinding the grain with a mortar and however you say that. So by hand, they were grinding. They didn't have a Vitamix blender with the, grain container like I use. They were doing all this by hand. And when they were grinding, after they ground the barley or the wheat, and most people were eating barley because that was the more common thing. You were wealthy if you had wheat. But after you grinded your flour, then you added oil and water, and you would start to knead your dough. And from that dough, there would be a time of rest with a cloth over top of it, and then you would be ready to put it in the oven. And when you separate it into parts, and then you put the bread in the oven to make what we would technically call like a pita bread size, that's what they called their barley cakes. And these barley cakes were made, in a clay oven. And a lot of times the clay oven was outside in the courtyard. So you might have several women using the same oven. So there was sharing. There was, when you're done with that, I need to go next kind of a thing, okay? if they had an oven in their own home, then that one woman was managing the oven for her family. But these ovens were not just for preparing the bread. They would have also been like the fireplace to keep the house warm. That would have been the only source of heat besides body heat laying on the bamboo or grass bed. Then the other tasks that would have been inclusive during that time would have been the gathering of either mending or making clothes. So the woman would either be like on a loom, using the wool from the sheep or the goats to make a lamb's wool type sweater or cloak for herself or her family. Or she might be mending the linen dresses or togas that her family was using repeatedly day after day. And essentially they had I guess you would call it an undergarment slip. So everybody wore that undergarment slip to bed, and then their outer garment, the linen dress or toga, was what everybody saw them, that was their external dress code, okay? And then they'd have either a belt or a pouch where they would carry their food. Maybe they had a sword or their tools, stone tools for masonry. Maybe they had a leather bag to carry their tools. But that was the simplicity of these families. They did not have, a huge, U-shaped kitchen that, had upper and lower cabinets and a Vitamix blender and juicers, and that was not part of their reality. Their reality was one oven, not a toaster oven and a regular oven, and two kinds of ovens so that your food would be kosher. No, there were none of those quote religious laws that were given at that time. And in terms of utensils and bowls and plates and all of that, this was the part that I found so fascinating. They used one clay bowl. And that was the clay bowl that they actually put on the fire in the oven, okay? They cooked the entire meal in that clay pot or clay bowl. And the type of meal that they were making was onions, olive oil, lentils. Their main staple for food and protein was lentils. Red lentils, green lentils, fava beans, chickpeas. That was their main staple. Those beans that they soaked and rinsed, and then they added it into the pot and they made a stew. So you would have a lentil stew. And then they would have the spices. They would add cumin and coriander and dill and garlic. That was their main meal. So the lentils and the chickpeas or the fava beans might be the protein that would switch out. But their main diet was vegetarian. It was seed grain based. Their bread was their main source of food. The bread and the stew. And there were no forks and spoons and knives. That was not even of that time. What they did was they took the bread and they dipped the bread in the singular bowl. So imagine having a bowl on the table and everybody in your family is dipping into the same bowl with their piece of bread, and their bread is the utensil. It might even be a fight to hurry up and eat, because if that was all there was, it just goes to show that community was different back then. There was an order of okay, the men might get to eat first, or you would kind of defer that if the men were doing this hard manual labor, but then the women were doing really hard manual labor too. So there was a different level of cooperation. If you're all sharing one bowl and dipping your bread into one bowl to eat, it really shows the communal family belonging gathering that was going on at that time. And what we have now is all about independence. What kind of plate do you want? What kind of bowl do you like? What kind of utensil do you like? How pretty is it? You know, is it functional? You know, it's like we have so many choices. And they all are about like, I want this and I have a preference for that. And I don't like that. There was none of that. It was like the food was prepared. The food was put on the table. If you wanted to eat, that's what you ate. Now, when it came to Shabbat, for Friday night to Saturday night, gathering to, you know, read the Torah and have discussions, that meal for that particular evening and day was, again, maybe they would have fish that was caught. So on Friday, they would have fish. And that might be like grilled tilapia. And it was just the fish. And maybe there was like some herbs stuffed in it when they grilled it on the open fire. But that's it. Okay? And they'd have like dried nuts like almonds and pistachios and figs and goat cheese, because if they were farming and they had goats or sheep, they would have the cheese. So the point is, like, their diet was a simple vegetarian diet, and one time a week, not every day, one time a week, they had fish. Okay? And then if it was a feast, and we're talking like Passover, then they would have the Passover lamb. They would have roasted lamb. If it was somebody's wedding, maybe they would have some kind of beef because it was a wedding. But outside of that, their normal day-to-day life was vegetarian, plant-based, and one time a week, fish. So it really goes to show that if you look at the people of that time, number one, they were walking every single day to go to and back, to and fro their responsibilities, to carry water, to build stone structures, to bake bread, to, you know, make and mend clothing, to walk to the marketplace. All of these things required walking, and these people easily were making their 10,000 steps a day, for sure, okay? So they were walking. There was no Uber. There was no individual private cars or several cars in one family. If you wanted to go somewhere, you walked. And if you walked, that also meant you had to be able to carry whatever you were taking from point A to point B. So it really goes to show how we are so spoiled. We really have no clue of how hard it was during this time. And yet, when I reminisce about thinking about, they had no electricity, they had no indoor plumbing, they had no running water, okay? And yet, they were honoring God our Father. Seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all these things will come to you. They had a personal relationship with God the Father. They understood the Torah. They followed the 10 Commandments. They kept themselves pure with modesty. And, let's come back to the plumbing and water. I wanted to talk about that again. So, women of today, we generally take multiple showers depending on what our activities are and where we're going. And then we have all these lotions and potions for our hair and for our skin and for beautification. And the price tag to owning and managing all of these things is high. And many times guys will say, oh, well, I want a high maintenance woman. Well, in order to have a high maintenance woman, there's a price tag associated with being with a high maintenance woman. Because if she requires all those things and you want to, quote, take care of her, then financially, there's this assumption that you're going to take over all of those expenses that she takes to manage herself. Now, I'm not saying against one way or another. I'm just trying to make a point. Back in that day, in Jesus' time, women did not wear makeup. Their beautification ritual was olive oil. That's it. That was it. They put olive oil on their skin. They put olive oil on their hair. They covered their hair with a shawl or, a head wrap of some kind. And they were not needing all of these, quote, modern day things that we think that we need. And I'm just saying, like, they lived very simply and they didn't have all the problems that we have today with sickness and illness and chemical sensitivity and all those other things that are in many of those beauty products. But olive oil, first pressed olive oil, it's pure, it's simple, and it works. And I've got to tell you, for my skincare routine now, I just use either 3 types of oils. I use coconut oil, olive oil, and canola oil. Castor oil. Castor oil, coconut oil, and olive oil are the 3 oils that I use on my face and my body. And I don't pay for any of those other beauty products that I used to pay for. I don't do any of that anymore. Okay, so let's come back to the water. They did not have showers or bathtubs in their homes or near their homes. If they wanted to take a bath, they went into a water body, a stream, a lake. They maintained their hygiene with like a simple basin, little water basin bath, which means that like a bowl of water and like a washcloth, and they would, do a quick wipe down, and that was their cleaning hygiene routine. And they purchased high quality essential oils like frankincense, myrrh, what's the other one? I'm forgetting the other third one. But anyway, the point is they purchased high quality essential oils for smell. And that also, because they were in close proximity with their family and with their community, you did not want to be considered the stinky one. So you were putting some essential oil on you to manage your hygiene and your body odor. So they didn't have, Calvin Klein and Coco Chanel, like crazy expensive perfumes. I'm not knocking those perfumes. I've liked those perfumes. I've worn those perfumes. What I'm saying is that how they managed their, quote, smell was simplicity again. Buying things in its original form. Essential oil with the carrier oil of olive oil. They would rub that over their body, and the olive oil would protect their skin from the sun and the harsh elements and the chapped hands from working with stone. And the essential oil would give them a flavor, a smell that was pleasing to the nose. So everything that this group of people did during this time, we can look at it today and say, wow, that's drastic. I don't know if I could ever, do it like that. But I want to make the comparison now to the tiny house movement and to van life, because there is a parallel here. In the tiny house van life experience, you are minimizing and paring down your items to fit in 400 square feet. If you're in a tiny house, that's the norm. And if you are in a van or RV situation, you might be like a van situation is like 200 square feet. A tiny living, like large RV or tiny house would be 400 square feet. So if you look at the fact that most of us live in 2-bedroom houses or more than that in terms of space, we have multiple bedrooms, we have kitchen, we have a dining room, we have a living room, we have a family room, we have an office or a den, we have a garage, we have an attic, we have a basement, we have outdoor space and patio furniture, we have a garage and a shed, we have a barn, we have animals and supplies and gardening supplies. And so what I'm trying to illustrate is, as a people of today, we have a lot of things that are in those spaces, and that stuff takes up real estate space, and it creates clutter if we're not managing it correctly. So during that time when the people of Nazareth were living in these small 400 square foot homes, it was a big open room. If they were dealing with colder temperatures, what they would do is they would section off the room. That the furthest part of the room would be where the family would lay down and sleep on the straw mats. And if they had a really cold evening, or they were concerned about being robbed in the middle of the night of their animals, they would bring the animals indoors in the same space, the same 400 square feet as where they were. So imagine laying down on the floor on a grass mat, cuddled up with your family, with your wool coat as your blanket, not your down comforter, not your USB light and your ceiling fan and your whatever nighttime routines that you're used to. Just 400 square feet, you and your family on the floor, not your cozy mattress, okay? And the animals, your goats, are in the same room. It's humbling, okay? Maybe in the morning, somebody, maybe one of the goats, relieve themselves. Then you have to clean up excrement off of the floor. And I'm just saying, it's a very different situation than what we are so privileged to experience today. But coming back to the tiny living of 400 square feet or 200 square feet living in a van, when you only have the minimalistic supplies that you need, and I'm in my van and I go to a destination, I'm still in my van living in luxury compared to how they were living. I've got my TV and my laptop and my camp stove and my plates and pots and supplies and clothing and Murphy bed. And I'm saying, even though I have simplicity, for me, consider, in comparison to today's standards, how I'm living in my van is very simple. But according to and comparing to how those people lived in 400 square feet with an entire family versus me just being alone in my 200 square feet. It's very interesting and humbling, and it makes you really think about what is important. And when Jesus made these statements like, I am the bread of life, it now has a different meaning to me, because if during that time of Nazareth, the people that lived in those 400 square foot houses, if their main food was bread and lentils or lentil soup, imagine like your normal food for the day is some hummus and bread. That's it. Maybe a piece of cheese and some figs off of a local tree. That was your diet the entire day. Okay? We think that's like so extreme and so minimalist, but those people thrived. They were not fat. They were not obese. They did not have all of the health problems that we have, because they were eating simply, and they were walking daily. They were not, they didn't need a vibration plate machine to get their jiggle on. Like, they were walking just to get their day done. That was their exercise. They didn't have a gym membership to Planet Fitness, okay? Or something more exclusive. It just goes to show that their simple way of living worked. And if Jesus himself, if Yeshua, the Messiah himself, was brought into the lowest of low standards, meaning the poorest, impoverished label, that's how he came into the world, to humble himself. He's the king, and yet he humbled himself with those parameters, okay? And just saying he was Jesus, Yeshua of Nazareth, like as soon as he announced that he was from Nazareth, like people did not think very highly of him, because Nazareth was like the cesspool, like it was the lowest of low. And we just don't understand that. Sometimes we forget the privileges that we have, but also that if the Lord himself took that lowly position, and here we are like having all of these possibilities and opportunities, and we're not grateful, and we have like 20 times more physical space and a private vehicle and everything else, and we're not happy, we're not grateful. Like, seriously, it really is like eye-opening. And for me, it also showed that I'm actually gonna stop here and pick up in another video with the next topic, so I'm kind of gonna leave it on a hanger on that. So check out the next video, and it is going to be about being mobile and nomadic. Okay, so if you could please, if you've made it thus far, if you could do a thumbs up, like, and if you could make a comment what you liked, what you didn't like, it just does help to get the channel to grow. And that's one area that I don't know much about, but I really would appreciate any support that you would be happy to give in sharing your positive feedback. Thank you so much. I hope that I was able to get you to think a little bit differently today, and that it may inspire you to simplify, come to a baseline a little less clutter than maybe what you had yesterday. Have a good one.